This happened about a year ago. I was 16 at the time, camping with my family, and also a good friend who we will call Zach, who is the same age as me. We were out camping in a campground called Miquelon Lake, which is a campground in central Alberta, Canada. The lake is basically drying up ship pile now, but the scenery is nice, and we know most of the staff at the park. The campground is of modest size and is often filled to capacity. There are a series of trails over by the park center that takes you through the forest. We decided to walk down one of those in the evening. After some walking, we found an old trail that we had not taken before. It was overgrown, but you could clearly tell it was a pathway, and so we took it to see where it would go. After walking for about 15 to 20 minutes, we heard some rustling in the bushes. Zach figured it was a beaver, as they were common around here. But I looked, into my horror, I saw Cougar's face peering at us from behind the bushes. I could barely make out a jealous eyes, but it did seem like the cougar was moving, and yet we still heard the rustling in the bushes. I pointed at it and told Zach, and he began to panic. Cougars often try to stay away from humans, but they are getting more common. So even though they are unlikely, it is not impossible to find one. I told Zach to remain calm and backpedal away with me, and we began to backpedal. I could tell he was scared shitless, but I told him the wrestling was probably a geong, and we probably stumbled upon its nest by accident. I figured so long we made a point to backpedal away, the cougar would let us go. We backpedaled down the trail for some time. When we felt we were safe, we turned our backs and continued walking. We rounded a corner, only to find the cougar standing there on the trail in front of us. It was staring at us and obviously wanted to attack us. I was shocked at how fast and quietly it was able to pass us. At this point, it was clear the cougar was toying with us and that an attack is imminent. I had a K-bar knife on me at the time, in case the situation got worse. And so I pulled it out. Truthfully, a knife probably would not save our lives against such an amazing predator. But it is better than having nothing. It's a usual tool, a weapon for hunting or defense. So, it was better than nothing. I think Zach knew the cougar was probably going to attack too, giving my reaction to the situation in the cougar's odd behavior. We were both tall for our age, and though Zach was scrawny, I was quite muscular for my age. Even so, if the cougar chose to attack us, we would be in trouble. I told him to backpedal away once again and to stay close. He did not listen though. He booked it. Before I knew the cougar was running towards us. It was fast. I chose to fight as my natural response to danger. It was probably also my best chance of survival at this point, as running would be my only result in this being attacked and dismembered. Perhaps, if I bought Zach some time, you would be able to get help from people walking the trails, or there was always the possibility that he would rush to my aid. The cougar got close to me, so fast that I barely had time to react. I plunged my knife into its torso. Right as it jumped towards me, it growled in pain, but the wound, though it was deep, was not lethal. Perhaps maybe I just hit a rib. He shoved me to the ground, clawed my right hand, forcing me to let go of the knife, and tried to bite my throat while sinking his claws into my shoulders. Zach at this point was running away yelling for help. To be honest, I do not blame him. Yes, you probably should have helped me out while screaming for help, but some people, which did just too afraid and they don't know how to react. I protected my throat with my left arm, which was lucky by my chest before it clawed my shoulder, so I was able to defend myself. It bit my arm, which was the worst pain I have ever felt. I could hear the sound of its teeth puncturing my arm and ripping it to pieces. I remembered advice from some show stating that shoving your arm down a predator's throat initiates its gag reflex, forcing it to stop biting you at least for a moment. Remembering this, I shoved my arm further down his throat, and the pain got worse, but I was able to fight through it, and thanks to my adrenaline rush. The cougar gagged and promptly let go of after the struggle. This gave me a few seconds at the most to prepare for the next attack. However, I was still at its mercy, and I knew my chances of survival at this point were low. Suddenly, I heard a loud bang, and the cougar let out a small whimper before falling on his side. I stood up and saw a park ranger running towards me along with Zach. At this point, the pain in my left arm was starting to set in. It was messed up bad, and so were my shoulders, both deeply scratched. I did not realize it hurt me as bad as I thought it did until I looked up and felt the pain set in. He explained that other hikers had reported the cougar earlier, and so he came to the trails to find it and heard Zach's cries for help. After performing the first aid, he took it to his truck, which was quite a walk, to get me to Zach to our site and to get me to the nearest hospital, as my wounds were serious. It could easily become infected. My parents ended up driving me there as the ranger could not leave the campground on duty. Leaving Zach in the trailer at her site, Zach was shaken, but he was amazed that I was still alive. I needed stitches for my shoulders and my left arm, which to this day is still damaged permanently. But it could have been a lot worse. It was a very terrifying moment of my life, and I could have easily died there. Later, after I was treated, I talked to an expert from the park. He told me that the cougar attacked us because it was in pain, and we approached his nest and had porcupine quills in his throat. He said that it probably would have left us alone if we did everything right, at least initially. If it wasn't for the quills in his throat, we probably never would have been attacked at all. I was starting my New Year's resolution of getting into shape and started to go for 20-minute jogs around my neighborhood every night. I was on day 20 or so of my jog and was getting used to the trail that I took every time. It was a concrete path that goes along a big lake and around outside of my suburb. Most of the path is surrounded by trees in a parkland. I would usually run at night at around 9 p.m. because it's a lot cooler at night and I like the solitude. I would never see anyone at this time, and I've only seen one or two people the whole time I've been doing it. It does get a little bit creepy at times, as it is so dark. Usually, the only light source being the moon. But I never felt scared while running. But this night was different. I was running through part of the trail that has some public exercise equipment off the side of it, so I decided to stop and use it to burn some extra calories. I would do this often during my run. This particular exercise machine was for exercising your chest and was attached to a machine for exercising shoulders. After I had done my first set, I had to take a little break to get my breath back. Still sitting at the machine, it was deadly quiet. All you could hear were the insects from the nearby lake. After a second, I heard someone sit down on the shoulder machine directly behind me. It scared me and I suddenly got an overwhelming feeling of dread and anxiety. I never get scared or nervous easily, but this creeped me out, as I did not see anybody ahead of me on the trail before I sat down. I could see a good 50 meters ahead, so I would have seen someone coming. I also wondered why they wouldn't say hello or make themselves known to me. At this point, I noticed that all the insects in the area had gone quiet. This in itself creeped me out. I looked back to make sure someone was actually there, and there was a bald-headed man around 40 or 50 with perfect posture, just sitting in the shoulder machine, facing the opposite way from me. He wasn't wearing workout clothes and looked like he was wearing an old blazer. He kept looking forward and didn't acknowledge me at all. I'm a really logical person, and something about this situation didn't add up in my mind. I thought to myself that this guy was a serial killer and that there was no reason whatsoever why he would just be sitting there. There is also a park bench about 5 meters away that he could have sat on if he wanted a normal seat. So it wasn't because of that. I turned around and did one more set, as not to look freaked out. When I finished, I casually stood up and went to continue my jog, and I noticed the man was gone. I looked all around and he wasn't anywhere to be seen. There were a few treads scattered around the park, but other than that, there was nowhere else he could have gone at the time. I continued to jog up the path, partly hoping I could catch up to him, mainly because it would be better of him being behind me. I ran for 5 minutes and didn't see anyone. There was literally nowhere he could have gone unless he was hiding behind a tree or disappeared into thin air. After that, I head home. To this day, I have no idea who the man was, but I have 3 theories. 1. The man was a weirdo, trying to get a rise out of people and purposely snuck up on me and sprinted away behind a tree. 2. He was a ghost haunting the area, which is why he was wearing old clothes. Also, the park is really old and was one of the first places settled in Western Australia. I don't believe in this one that much. 3. He was a normal guy out for a walk that stopped for a seat who didn't want to talk. Then so happened to walk off trail through the park, perfectly being covered by each tree as I ran, creating a continuous blind spot where I couldn't see him. One year, a group of us went camping in Kearney, Ontario, where we always go camping. Whenever we go, we always form our tents in a big circle with the fire pit in the middle of us. We've been drinking, smoking a few joints, and a few of us tripping balls on shrooms. The first night we were there, this guy randomly walks into our circle, introduces himself. I can't remember the name he gave, that he was in the military and decided to take some vacation to camp out a bit. He asked if he could join our fire, as it was getting late and he didn't buy any firewood. Being the friendly stoned people we are, we let him join our fire. He even pitched in some money for the firewood. The night went on, and we all were having a good time. One by one, our group started heading off to bed, me being either the second or third. I remember waking up to the sound of someone talking and the fire being started. It was 4 in the morning. I peeped out my tent and saw the random just sitting on the log by the fire, talking to himself. Still tripping on shrooms, I thought to myself, I am in no condition to deal with this, and chalked it up to me just tripping out. I wake up the next day and everyone is still alive, thankfully, and the fire is smoldering. We look at the campsite, where the random guy was staying, and it was spotless. No garbage, no tracks in the trail around the site, no nothing. We all started talking about him, just to be sure we all saw him. Through talking, we managed to figure out that he must not have slept at all, and the last 2 of our group passed out at 3:30 a.m. The first person got up just after 6 a.m. and noticed he was gone. The rest of the camping trip went well, and we all went home. Fast forward maybe 4 to 5 years, I flip on the news and there's this picture of someone I could swear I recognize. He was arrested for a bunch of crimes, including rape and murder. Guess who it was? It was the random guy who joined our fire. I don't know why I remembered his face, but I guess it was just a weird situation where my brain right-clicked, saved as a JPEG in my brain. Now, I have no way of proving it was the same guy. We didn't take any pictures of the random, but the picture jump-started my memory and made me instantly remember the weird random fire joiner. It started several years ago. My and my friends' interest in urban exploration. I was a junior in high school at the time, which was when everyone started to earn a lot more freedom, so we took the chance to be out late whenever we could. Now, keep in mind that I live in a major city in central Colorado, so the nightlife is never lacking. We could always find something to do, and we're especially drawn to the element of danger. We wouldn't always plan these trips, but we made sure as hell that if we were going in any old building in the dark, that we would have a knife and a flashlight for safety. But we never really had to defend ourselves, but we came very close one evening. It must have been around November, because there wasn't yet snow on the ground, but it was really chilly. Directly across the street from the abandoned hospital, which we have hypothesized is still around from the TB era, is a hospital that is newer and in use. The two are connected by an underground tunnel, which I can only assume was a way to move bodies without alerting the patients. This is common, featuring among old hospitals. We have been inside there quite a few times. What was piquing our interest that night was the abandoned library next door to the hospital. It was connected, but only by exterior walls. To get inside, you could not cut through the hospital, but instead had to hop over a tall wall and climb over a very high fence. A few of us had backpacks containing the aforementioned safety precautions and a couple bottles of water, so nothing too heavy or valuable that would get damaged when we tossed it over the obstacle before us. A little ways off the road, it was dark. If you clung to the buildings, you did it for a while before stepping behind a patch of shrubbery, which we determined was an easy way to the first wall, since the only way to gain access was by a chained, unclimbable gate at the bottom of a set of stairs facing away from the ledge. Both were parallel with the library, so when tucked back in the corner behind the bushes, no one could see us from the street. I don't believe I went first, but I did not remain to be the last over that wall. It was too high up for me to jump and haul myself over, so I restored to stepping on a pipe, jutting out somewhere lower among the wall. It gave me a bit of a needed boost, and soon I was up and over. Moving into the library's courtyard, another girl and I waited for our two friends to get over and join us. Upon an initial glance over the courtyard, there was no obvious way in. To our right was a dilapidated fountain, which I took joy in imagining spraying forward a spray of water from its detailed stonework in the brighter summer months. People laughing and talking, and the surrounding trees bringing them shade. Now, however, it had been in long disuse, and the earth at our feet was cold and hard. There were no signs of another soul for years, save the 15-foot chain link fence directly in front of us separating the courtyard in half. I could tell you it hadn't seen the same weather at the rest of the courtyard because the metal showed no sign of rust. That must be our way in, we agree, because with a fence like that, someone obviously wanted to keep us out. We hurled our bags over the fence, hearing them clank on the ground, and rather silently due to their lightness. I was the third one over because I have a slight fear of climbing, and it took me a bit to mentally prepare myself. I made it to the top of the fence in short time, then I sat atop of it, straddling it with my leg on either side. I was thinking that had to have been one of the scariest things I've ever been done in a while, because I tend to avoid climbing at all costs. Of course, this isn't a rational fear, as I've never fallen, but that phobic fear didn't ever compare to what happened next. The last girl's feet hit the ground, and all four of us split up in a smaller half of the courtyard, looking for any kind of entrance. We decided that breaking a window would be too loud and draw unwanted attention. Not to mention, we could really get cut up. So that wasn't an option. Searching for a little longer, we didn't find anything that looked remotely plausible. Until we found a gate near the base of where the walls met. I couldn't believe we hadn't noticed it before, and upon closer inspection, the grate was already moved slightly from its resting place, so it would be easy to lift the rest of the way. The smallest and least fearful of our group went first. After moving the grate, there was a small drop down. It was no more than 3 feet down and 2 feet wide. But inside, there was another drop down where we could see into the library basement. She hopped out into the small, squared landing, only to almost immediately freeze. We looked among ourselves, wondering what was wrong. "There's a guy down here," she said. "Wait, where?" "I can see his outline," she said. I leaned forward and tried to take out a step, but I leaned forward and tried to make out a shape, but it was further down than my line of sight permitted and too dark. "Hello?" she called out. He responded the same, asking who we were. "Just a couple of chicks," she spat out bluntly. What he said next sent chills down my spine, and it was as if the feel of darkness radiating out of that hole in the ground. All of a sudden, it was very still and quiet, and the darkness had spilled out and weighed all over us. He said, in what I can only describe as a lustful tone, dripping with all intent, "I'm addicted to following the sound of women's voices." My friend looked over at us blankly, but there was nervousness underneath, unease, and something in his voice sounded like it wasn't an empty threat, like he wasn't just saying something creepy to get us to leave. She looked back to where he was and said lowly, "That's not cool." The man under the dark earth began laughing maniacally, and not in the kind of way a really good actor does, in the way that you could feel his utter insanity hit us like stale air. We looked at each other for what felt like hours in the gloomy courtyard, but I knew it was only a couple of seconds, because we all exchanged without even speaking that we had to get out of there, and now. I was not about to risk some nutcase coming after us, even if we did now. The friend scrambled up out of the landing, and I was never over a fence faster in my life. 15-foot potential fall, and I didn't even take the time to think about it. We didn't stop running until we were halfway down the streets, down the block, and out of breath. I can still hear that laugh. I'm a seasonal ranger for my local forest district. Despite the fact that I live in a fairly suburban area, the forest preserves still make up 12% of the county, with much of the property being heavily wooded. Not far out wilderness, but pretty secluded in some areas. Being a seasonal employee, I have been on the job for a bit over a month now, but in my short time, I have found a creepy things. Here are 3 of those things. 1. A dead man in a tree. The rest of the rangers say that they find about 1 suicide a year. So here was the one for the year. When we go around opening parks each day, we drive through to make sure everything is okay. In this instance, I was driving through and had just lost sight of the road when I saw a man hanging from a tree in a clearing. He had hung himself. I called the cops in the corner. Freaking corner. Took about an hour to show up. He was the only one with the ladder long enough to cut the guy down, so I stared at a dead guy in a tree for about an hour. 2. Crazed. Drugged up naked man running around a parking lot. It took me and 3 other rangers to catch him. When we finally caught him, found out that he had multiple cuts across his body, running through brush, and had a rock ledged firmly up his ass. 3. A headless deer. Normally, when a pack of coyotes take down a deer. Yes, we have a bunch of coyotes around here. They leave bite marks all over the body, along with torn flesh everywhere. But the head was cleanly sliced off and placed directly off next to the body, meaning this is something created by human intervention. We still haven't figured out that one yet, and I have only been on this job for 5 weeks, so you can only imagine what a full-time forest ranger has probably seen over a long career. I was working as a prospector's assistant in central Manitoba one summer. We were doing a helicopter-assisted magnetic anomaly investigation. Best summer of my life. There's nothing like ringing in your ears dissipating after the helicopter has dropped you off and slowly increasing volume of the bugs taking its place. You know for sure you are in the middle of nowhere. It was the last day of our campaign. This was a little piece of the property close enough to a road that we didn't need a helicopter. It was a low-priority target and was saved until the end. We had kicked so much ass during the high-priority targets, we decided to do this one on the last day just for an easy in and out of the bush. Around 9 a.m., we heard yelling in the bush, which was odd. Nobody else should be out here. We kept on grabbing samples, and it's in the back of our mind. Around 11, we hear it again. It's a little closer this time, though. We cut back and call out again, but it was silence. Now, through our travels of this 30-kilometer piece of property, we came across many pieces of animal evidence. Deer, moose, and rabbit droppings were everywhere. A few carcasses here and there. Bear tracks and bear feces were seen a few times, but nothing prepared us for what happened next. Around noon, we were in an old blast, open the 80s. Prospector Dave told me he used to have a blasting license, and that blowing shit up in the middle of nowhere is really fun while drinking beer is his favorite pastime as a prospector. They changed the laws a few years ago, though, so now they can't do it because it caused way too many forest fires. We were facing due west with our GPS on some rocks, getting the most precise UTM it could, when we hear an earth-shattering, bone-chilling howl. I looked at Dave, and he turned so white he was almost green. I picked up the GPS and put it in my belt and unclicked my bear safety spray. Then, at our 9 facing due west, another wolf, then another at our 10 and another, all the way to our 4, Dave calmly said, "We need to leave, but you cannot. Run. If you run, you die." We left most of our sampling shit there. We also carry these modified steel sledgehammers for breaking rock and scraping moss. Most useful, durable thing I've ever had. It's at the ready, along with my bear spray, and we walk, longest walk in my entire life. We didn't say a word, and I didn't hear anything. But I'm positive they followed us back to the road and into the truck. We drove back to town and proceeded to get thoroughly drunk. One of my best buddies from college was a geologist major that ended up becoming a ranger in the Southeast United States. We haven't spoken in years, as is the case with age. But I remember about 8 to 9 years back, he was telling me about an old married couple that he had recently helped out. He had seen them come to the park several days in a row and found out they were visiting from out west and they had gotten engaged there decades prior. They have been searching for a spot they taking pictures of when they popped the question about having trouble. After looking at the pics and figuring out roughly where they were trying to get to, he escorted them in his vehicle, then hied them to where he thought that it would be. They found it, and he left them there and went back to his station at the entrance. He said he got a weird feeling when he got back and felt like he needed to wait to see them whenever they left. Well, once it came time to lock up at night, he still hadn't seen them leave, so he reported it. He left his assistant to wait at the shack at the entrance and wait for them where he left them. He went back to try to find them. He found them both there, laying down, spooting along the bank of the river. Neither were alive. He called the cops, went through the 9 yards, and went home. The police were able to disclose them to their identities, but weren't sure of anything else initially. Later, he learned that the wife was terminally ill with cancer, and they both committed suicide by ingesting some sort of chemical pill combination. They just chose to do it where they had gotten engaged at. My bud wasn't torn up about it. He was obviously sad for them dying, but said he thought that they wouldn't have asked for help earlier because they didn't want anyone to think that they helped kill them. I am a 29-year-old, and I have been researching and investigating the paranormal since I was the age of 9 in 1998. I'm an extremely realistic and logical person, and I am not easily excited over things I go bump in the night. I've seen and experienced some things in my life which most people will not believe. But that's okay, because I'm not here to convince anyone of anything. I'm just here to share. My light in the sky experience happened a few years ago. In 2014, I was living in New York and had gone to Jones Beach State Park one fall night with a friend of mine. It was a chilly night, so we didn't plan on staying out long, but it was nice to be able to walk along the boardwalk without dealing with crowds of people. We had stopped at a cover picnic area to sit down and chat. The night was clear enough to see the stars, which can sometimes be difficult with all the light pollution on Long Island. We lost track of time with our conversations, and as we got up to leave, I glanced up at the sky. I loved the stars and noticed something. It was a very bright light had appeared over the horizon that wasn't there a moment ago. My friend, seeing that I was staring off into space, literally looked up and thankfully saw it as well. Of course, we had two initial thoughts. One, it was an airplane, or two, it was just another star. We watched it for a few solid minutes, and it never moved from where I sat. Ruling out the possibility of being an airplane, side note, my boyfriend is an airline pilot, and I spent a lot of time watching airplanes. This is definitely not a plane. So, a few moments go by when we notice a second light, just as bright as the first, appears seemingly out of nowhere. It manifested, if you will, right below the first light, and just hover there. Naturally, we look at each other in exchange, perplex glances. When we look back up again, a third light appeared below the first two. I don't know how long we stood there looking at these lights, but we did verbally discuss all the possibilities that might explain what they were. We tried very hard to be realistic in debunking this phenomenon. After a while, the light shifted, taking on a triangular pattern. Again, we stood, mesmerized, and watched. They did not change positions again. After that, it felt like forever. We finally decided that we should leave. It was starting to get late, and we started to walk away, assuming that when we looked back, lights would be gone. They weren't. They stayed right there in the sky, in that triangular pattern for almost our entire walk back to the car. Only when we reached the park exit did they disappear. We do believe what we saw were UFOs, though I'm not 100% comfortable labeling as an alien per se. This happened about 3 years ago in Western Maryland. It was late September, and 3 of my friends and I were at a camping trip at a state park outside of Cumberland. We got there pretty early in the afternoon and set up camp because we wanted to hike around a bit before it got dark. Anyway, after we got back to camp and the sun had gone down, we gathered some wood for a fire. We were in the process of building the fire when we noticed a light suddenly appeared at the top of the hill by our campsite. We were down in a small valley with steep hills all around us, and it was very dark because it was heavily forested. We all kind of ignored it, thinking it was either the moon coming up or maybe there was a building that we had noticed before. As time went on, I became curious about the light. Like, I need to go up there and see what it was. My friends didn't share my curiosity and had no desire to check it out. They just kept telling me it was the moon coming up, and I was being stupid. To me, the light didn't appear like anything moonlight, and it wasn't really like moon, so it was starting to creep me out. I took off up the hill and put my mind at ease. The hill was densely forested and full of briars. It was totally dark except for the light up ahead, so I had to proceed carefully. I was almost to the light when I heard something moving up ahead. I stopped so I could hear it better, assuming it was a deer or some other woodland creature. However, it didn't sound like a deer. It sounded like something, maybe a person sneaking in the woods, moving slowly so it's not to make much noise. Then I heard another sound coming from the other side of me. I froze, trying to get an idea of what was approaching me. The footsteps got closer, and I just stood there waiting for whatever it was to find me. Then I saw it. It was the classic gray alien, about 5'5", and the light from ahead was reflecting off of its skin. That is the only thing I remember about it. I didn't get a very good look at it. I was just kind of scared, and I think I lost consciousness. The next thing I remember, I was picking myself up off the ground. It didn't seem like any time had passed, but there was a definite lapse of consciousness, like I was taking out and reinserted into time. I decided to go back to the campsite. I could see the light from the fire from my friends had made, but on my way back to camp, I start hearing voices inside my head. I have no history of schizophrenia and consider myself a very calm and controlled person. I have never had anything like this happen to me before or since. The voices were very subtle, but they were definitely there. At first I was kind of ecstatic, but I was actually communicating with what I thought were aliens. This is the most amazing thing to have ever happened to me. They tell me I am special, and they chose me to make contact because I was open-minded. However, they soon start mocking me, and their tone gets very ugly, and they begin to sound almost demonic. They tell me I'm going to burn in hell and to kill myself. They tell me to throw myself into the campfire and get it over with. I am terrified at this point, and I can't get the voices to stop. I get back to the campsite, and my friends are enjoying themselves like nothing had ever happened. They talk to me, but their voices sound different. They sound like their voices, like were the ones that are heard in my head, and all I can understand is that they hate me, want me to die. I pretty much have a panic attack and lay down on the ground crying. The voices in my head continue to torment me and just keeps getting worse. Finally, my friend starts holding me and telling me everything is fine. We are both atheists, or at least agnostic, but for some reason, she tells me to pray for Jesus. I start praying out loud and asking Jesus to help me. I do this for quite a while, and the voices finally die down and go away. I go to lay down and try to sleep to forget about what just happened, and I see the moon coming up over the hill. About 2 years ago, on a summer day, my dad and I went for a quick hike on the hills that overlook our city. On the hills, there are many reservoirs, many of which are surrounded by the woods of fir trees and are places of great beauty and quiet usually. The particular reservoir we were hiking to provided us wonderful views of the city, and we knew the route well. However, since we had been hiking in the late afternoon, we only had an hour or so before dusk set in. We decided to walk fast. We trekked up the pebble path from the bump gate that loops around the reservoir. You can't actually see the water until you've scaled a small mound in front first. Well, Dad and I were nearing the mound, heading towards the water, when things got really strange. This man, probably in his 20s, was running barefooted and shirtless along the mound from one side to the other, back and forth, back and forth. over and over again. Huh, I thought, that's odd. Yes, it was summer, but where I live, summer is not a guarantee of warmth. So, even though it was August, there was still a sharp chill in the air. Plus, we were quite a few feet up to the rush of winds and have made it too cold to run half naked like this. Maybe he was doing it all for a thrill, or maybe he was hammered. We didn't stay long enough to find out. As we approached the water, a good distance from the odd runner, we could see the remnants of a fire ahead of some fir trees. Then ashes, sands were littered in strips of burnt foil, and realized there must have been some drug use here. We thought that might explain our runner friend over there. The man was utterly oblivious to us, so we passed by and he seemed harmless enough. But when we were behind the woods, climbing over the rocky pathway, we saw another man, stumbling and blinking like a drunk. His clothes were filthy. His general appearance was unkempt. He looked rough, and he'd probably been sleeping that way too. Perhaps he'd even been camping on the hills. I was a little uncertain, to be honest. This man stank of alcohol, seemed to be doused in stuff, and he was grumbling to himself as he lumbered by. I worried that he was drunk enough to give us a hassle, perhaps even follow us about. He looked at me oddly, in a way that made me extremely uncomfortable, and I just wanted him to get away from me. Thankfully, he passed us slowly without any issue. I started to breathe normally again, but I was still on high alert. When we came around the reservoir through another bump gate, we noticed that the runner was gone. Didn't understand this, as I'd only seen him 5 minutes ago or so I looked around and tried to spot the man himself or his clothes, as I was curious about him. He'd been acting really weird, like he was completely out of it. So I was peering through trees, trying to peek over the reservoir mound. I even looked behind me, up onto the hill. In case he had snuck by us, it was climbing up and I didn't see him. We were passing through the gap between some trees, and I was looking into the woods to see if I could find the runner between the firs. But then I saw something and stopped. And not just something, but someone. Someone sitting amongst the trees with dark eyes and face. Eyes that glared at me. What the hell? I was close enough to see that the lurker was a man. His clothes were baggy and his hair was long. I couldn't see his face too well, but I could see his mouth open, and I stared closely. It was like he was snarling at me, like a vicious animal. I was thinking to myself, what the fuck is he doing in the trees? He was crouching about 50 feet from us, quiet and alone. It occurred to me that he may have been the runner, but I soon realized that it couldn't have been the runner, because the runner returned, jogging along the mound about a minute later. The drunk we had passed had gone in another direction, and I hadn't seen anybody else up there. So it was really creepy to just see this person sitting there, lurking amongst the trees. I tried to pretend that I hadn't seen the creeper in the woods and continued walking. My heart rate was accelerating and my head gathered a cool sweat. The thought of him just watching us made me shiver. At least, my dad was with me. Walking back seemed to take an age, and my nerves made it difficult to move. I was tempted to look back round, but I didn't want him to know that I'd seen him, in case he panicked and took action. It was getting pretty dark now, and Mr. Lurker about twice as scary, so I wanted to get away from them all the weirdos, even the seemingly harmless ones. Back in the car, I told my dad about the men in the trees. He hadn't seen them. I don't know if my dad truly believed me. Perhaps he felt like I was exaggerating and the supposed malicious intent on the creep's face. But I swear he was scowling and snarling slightly at me. It was freaky. I'd never gone to this part of the hills late again, due to this experience. It is truly a beautiful spot, and I love going there, but I guess you could say it's pretty dodgy around dusk. I was backpacking in Arkansas, the Eagle Rock Loop in the Washita National Forest. There's a section of the trail that goes through an area called the Albert Pike Recreation Area. In June of 2010, a flash flood killed 20 people, including men, women, and children. There's a ton of stories online about this event if you want to look it up. So I start my trip at Little Missouri Falls, going counterclockwise. It's 26 miles with some pretty good climbs. You can find a map of the loop on Google Images. So I hiked a fairly long day. If you Google Eagle Rock Loop map, you will find a basic sketch map, not the topo map, just one of the basic ones with the labels of the trails, mountains, and water crossings on Pinterest. At the bottom of the map, there's a single water drop with a yellow circle around it. This just means it's always a wet crossing. There are several yellow circled water drops. The single one at the very bottom right next to the Viles Branch Trail. That is exactly where I was camped, so anyone can go there if you want to look it up and see what I'm talking about. So, that is the Little Missouri River. The water is flowing away from Albert Pike. I'm maybe 4 to 5 miles downstream from where the flash flood occurred. Now, I don't know if this is significant or not to my story, but I'm not ruling it out either. I set up camp at about 4 p.m. for the day. This was November of last year. Fairly cold nights. It was about 26 degrees the night before. I was expecting another cold night in the high 20s. Not a lot of movement around there that night when it was cold. Most animals hunker down. I use a tarp where both ends are open. I have an inflatable sleeping pad and my 35-degree sleeping bag. Now, I'm set up on completely level ground. On my pad, on the tarp inside my sleeping bag, I quickly fall asleep around 10 p.m. after sitting around the fire. Everything is normal all evening, and all night for the most part. Now, you know when you're asleep and you fall in your dream? You get the sensation like you're falling in real life when you tense up and always wake up on impact. Okay, well I was asleep and I get the sensation sort of where I feel like I'm being dragged out of my tarp by my feet. Except it wasn't by my feet, I was being pulled by my sleeping bag. Like my whole pad with me in it suddenly being dragged out quickly. I woke suddenly as it startled me. Keep in mind, it was really cold. Low 30s to high 20s at this point. And I have a 35-degree sleeping bag. So I'm inside my bag all the way with the top closed off by a shock cord. I'm completely inside my bag covered to stay warm. Now, I'm wide awake and listening for any movement. Everything is still and quiet, except for the river next to me, obviously. That is the only sound I can hear. I didn't peek out my head. I just laid there awake and listening. I sat there for a good 15 minutes listening for any sound outside of the river. I never heard anything. Granted, the river is pretty loud being right there, but there was no movement around my camp at all. So I chalked it up to having that falling sensation when you dream. I figured I must have been dreaming about something and it made me feel like that I fell or something. I went to sleep for 30 or 45 minutes longer, still keeping my ears open but figuring I was probably just dreaming. So for the most part, I just shrugged it off and put my mind off of it and got back to sleep. Morning comes and I get up and put my shoes on and roll out of bed. I head straight over to the fire to put it and stoke at the fire for first thing because it's definitely cold outside at 6:30 a.m. this morning. I turn back towards my tarp and head over to get my food hanging close by. That's when I noticed it, and I froze. My pad and sleeping bag at the foot end are sticking out from under my tarp, by a good 1.5 feet at least. I can think about how now, as I felt being dragged out from under my tarp the night before, staring at how my bed is from under the tarp. I slowly approach the tarp and look for any sort of footprints. The problem is I don't even see my own because the ground is so compact around there. I double check and I'm not in any sort of slope at all. The ground is completely flat. I really have no idea how this happened, and I know I was startled awake by that sensation of swiftly sliding down the hill towards my feet. My pad with me in it was being dragged out. I quickly had breakfast, tacked up and headed out. I was supposed to spend one more night on the trail, but the longer I hiked, the more I thought that what would happen the next night. These thoughts running in my head the entire day as I walked. Could it have been another person? I didn't hear anything. Why would anyone do that to anyone else? How could I have slid down so far? Maybe it was an animal. It couldn't have been. There were no punctures in my mattress and there were no footprints anywhere. Did I just slide throughout the night with restless sleep? It doesn't make any sense. I normally sleep on a slight incline, and I've never slid outside of the tarp before. Was this paranormal? I'm not far from Albert Pike. Could this have been some sort of ghost trying to save me from a flash flood horror that I was reliving over and over? All day long, the same things were running to my head. I ended up hiking to my car and sleeping in there that night. The Athens Big Fort Trail was very tough going up over 6 mountains. It was almost dark after I descended the last one. I hiked the last 3 or so miles by headlamp in the dark. I wasn't keen on sleeping on the trail another night after that. Truth is, I've been on that trail a ton and will for sure go back. I've been all over Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, New Mexico, and Colorado. Around 750 miles and countless nights spent in the woods all over the place. I almost exclusively hike solo. I never carry a gun or bear spray. I don't carry a SAT phone or GPS transponder. That is the only weird and unexplainable thing that has ever happened to me regarding camping, backpacking, and the outdoors. On August 5th, 2001, on US Highway 287, which is 31 miles west of Palestine, Texas, I was traveling westbound at 65 miles per hour when I saw what looked like a bear cub or a very large dog sitting in the middle of the road. I slowed down to 15 miles per hour. I hit my high beams and stopped about 20 yards away from the animal. I put on my four-way flashers, turned on my interior spotlight. As I looked up, I saw a huge bipedal creature that I will call Bigfoot. It walked from the soft shoulder of the road to the animal in the road. As he, I am pretty sure it was a male, walked in front of my tractor, he shielded his eyes, not seemingly out of shyness, but more as an effort to protect his eyes from the bright lights. I reduced my headlights to a low beam, but decided not to turn them off as I was in the middle of the highway. I was doing my best to protect them by blocking the road with my tractor trailer. The big male went over to what I realized was a toddler. He grabbed his shoulder and attempted to grab the little one's arm. The little one scooted away like a child trying to get away from a parent that wants the child to go somewhere and the child doesn't want to go. The little one had greater agility than the big male. The little one squirmed, scrambled, and scooted further up the road where they were. Then, something caught my eye and ear directly next to my driver's window. I casually looked over, and within 2 feet of my face was a female. No doubt female. She had nursing breasts and extended nipples. Her eyes were almost even with my eye level. I measured it from where the top of her head came up to my mirror. It was 7 foot, 4 inches tall. The male was at least 1 foot taller than her, plus some. She had a gamey smile, but it didn't sting. Immediately upon seeing her, I smiled with all the teeth I have. From the interior spotlight, which was pointed down toward my lap, I am sure she was able to see me clearly. I certainly saw her clearly, so clearly I could smell her and feel her breath. I particularly noticed the volume of air that she breathed, not out of breath or even heavy breathing, just a large volume of air with each breath. I again smiled at her and asked, "Is the baby okay?" She slowly smiled back at me. I noticed a dental anomaly. Either she had a double row of teeth, or the crowns of her teeth were split on the top center to give the impression of 2 rows of teeth. She then reached into the tractor and stroked my beard, like I do when I'm thinking. My beard is mid-chest length and multicolor. It was then I realized the large male's head was identical to mine, although his beard was shorter. The female had thin facial hair on her chin. The rest of his fur was dark brown with traces of gray and white on his shoulders, back, and chest. She was a mixture of brown and reddish fur, mostly reddish-brown. As she took her hand off my beard and took her hand out of my tractor, I extended my hand out to her. She sandwiched my hand between her 2 hands, and her 2 hands were easily 2 to 3 times bigger than mine. Her hands felt like roughneck work gloves or rough leather. At this point, she gave me a soulful look. From her facial expressions and her watery eyes, I took what she was saying. "Thank you for not running over my baby." The eyes were not dead eyes. They were bright and moist, just very dark brown, but not black. The large male had the child under his arm, like a sack of potatoes. He never looked directly at me as I watched him walk back into the tree line. I noticed at least 3 more, I suspected even more, at the tree line. They ranged from the height of a female to slightly shorter, but none came close to the size of the male. This happened in either 98 or 99. The memory came flooding back to me several years after my father passed in 2008. It was not a suppressed memory. It was more like a decade or more of life got in my way, and I forgot about it. Anyway, I live in the Midwest, and it was either December or January. It was the time of year where high school is in season, but college is not, so just before Christmas, or possibly early January. I know because my brother was home from college, but I was cheering basketball games at the time. My dad was driving me from home from cheering at a varsity basketball game. It would have been after around 10:30 p.m. and either Tuesday or Friday, since that's when the games were. We live in the country, and I do remember it was cold and a brisk night. There was snow on the ground, and the moon was really bright, and the snow was almost sparkling. We came down our country gravel road and came to a top of the hill where all of our mailboxes were. Dad wanted to stop and get the mail. To the right, there are the mailboxes, and to the left is an expansive foreign field. There is no other way to put it, but to the left, there was a large cylindrical object hovering. I had a slant over the cornfield. The side tipped down where maybe 5 feet off the ground. There weren't any lights on it, and it made no sound. I think we kind of gaped at it for a while, and then we were like, what the fuck is that? I remember my dad saying that he was going to ask the farmer who owned the land if he had bought any new farm equipment. Mind you, this was the dead of winter, and no one would have been in the field with their farm equipment, let alone one that floats middle in the air like that. I remember saying to him, Dad, that's no piece of farm equipment. And he was like, yeah, I know, let's get out of here. And rode his little Ford Ranger off into the night down to our house. On the very short rest of the way home, we were like, oh my God, we have to tell my brother and mom. When we got home, my mom was experiencing a severe gallbladder attack. She had been having gallbladder problems for a while, and we didn't have any health insurance, so she had been putting off getting it checked out. Push came to shove, and that night we had to take her to the ER, and she had to have surgery, and this whole crazy experience got lost and was never talked about again. My dad passed in late 2007, and several years after that, like I said above, memory came back to me like a flood. Unfortunately, now I can't ask him about it if he remembers it too. I did work my way around to ask my mom if Dad ever mentioned anything to her over the years, and she said no, he hadn't. I really wish that I would have remembered before he passed, so I could have asked him more, frankly, that he was still here to ask today. It really bothers me, and I really want to know what he remembers from that night. I have an uncle that used to work as a ranger in Michigan. He's gone through nights of tigers, loose in a campsite without a working flashlight, drunk guys drowning in the rapids, and kids found dead from hypothermia, cradle peacefully at the bases of tall pines. But he never seemed disturbed when telling these stories. He saw it as just a part of the job. He took me and my middle brother on a walk through my grandparents' woods one evening while all the adults made dinner. The other two boys were completely occupied with a video game that was only 2-player, and so our uncle decided that he would give us two some special attention. Especially to me, as being the only girl, I would get excluded from a lot. We washed for maybe 15 minutes before my uncle stopped dead at the swamp area in the woods, a place we went to often to hunt for mushrooms in the summer. But right, in the middle of the soggy forest, Fluke was a 10-foot spiral staircase that none of us could ever remember being there before. It was like someone had built a house and everything, but the stairs had been swallowed up by the swamp. At the top was a very small landing, where a welcome mat and carpet sat, completely clean and untouched from what we could tell. I looked up at my uncle, and the look on his face struck me like a cold ice pick. He was terrified, shaking like it was winter, and his eyes darting around on the tree line like he was looking for something. He grabbed our hands and walked fast. I have always been very short and unable to keep up. I found myself being carried all the way back to the house. He set me down only when we were in direct sight of the house and told us not to say anything about it to anyone, especially the boys, and to not go outside of the house without him with us. We were very confused and scared, and as it sounded just insane, we kept our mouth shut. I recently went back home to visit and convinced my brother to come with me to see the staircase, though it took a lot of convincing to get him to come along, and he refused to go without our gun or 200-pound mastiff. We got out there to the right spot, and there was nothing, just a clearing. No bits of metal, no carpet, just an empty clearing in a nice big patch of mushrooms. Those mushrooms might have been our dinner, if our mastiff hadn't growled the moment we stepped towards them. It was probably at a deer, but we left quickly and have never been back or told anyone what we saw.